Okay, welcome to The Explainer. So today, we're diving into something really mind-bending. We're looking at a super advanced concept from chaos magic that's going to completely flip how you think about long-term goals. We're talking about hypersigils. If you've ever felt like, just setting an intention isn't quite cutting it for those massive life goals, well, buckle up because you're absolutely going to love this.
Just imagine for a second, what if your life was the spell? Usually we think of magic or, manifestation as this one-off thing. You do a ritual, you cast a spell, and then you just sit back and wait. But a hypersigil, it completely reframes that. It turns the whole act of creating your reality into this continuous, lived experience that you're actively directing.
So here's our roadmap for today. We'll be defining the hypersigil, looking at the components of the construct, comparing simple sigils to hypersigils, mapping out the living map, and wrapping up with the risks and realities. Let's just jump right in.
All right, part 1, defining the hypersigil, or the meta-sigil.
So what exactly is a hypersigil anyway? Well, think of it as a meta-sigil, or a sigil of sigils. Unlike a standard sigil where you're aiming for one highly specific thing, a hypersigil weaves together multiple desires, symbols, and even entire narratives into one giant overarching construct. It's meant to target a huge area of your life over a long period of time. You're not just asking for a promotion, you're essentially building the entire framework for your desired reality.
To kind of bring this down to earth, let's look at the guy who actually coined the term, comic book writer Grant Morrison. He famously said that his entire comic series, The Invisibles, was a hypersigil. It was this sprawling piece of narrative magic designed to trigger specific changes in his actual everyday reality. He basically took the act of writing, publishing, creating these characters, and turned the whole shebang into a massive ritual to alter his own life. Pretty wild, right?
And because a hypersigil is basically a symbolic script that unfolds over time, it's often called fourth-dimensional magic. It isn't just a static dot on a page. It's a continuous, living process that stretches across your timeline. You can think of it as an engine for manifesting the future, working its way through time itself.
Moving on to part 2, components of the construct, or how we actually build this engine. Now, a hypersigil is never just one simple symbol. It is a really meticulously layered collection. First off, you've got standard sigils acting as the discrete sub-goals, the stepping stones. Then you bring in traditional symbols to pull in established, recognized energies. And finally, you have the narrative elements. This could be characters, plot lines, or even just specific colors and shapes in a piece of art. All of these building blocks are carefully layered together to create this rich, compound intent.
Let's check out a super concrete example from author Daniel Domaratsky. He actually uses his own chest tattoo as a hypersigil. He uses a Shah star as the central foundational framework, but woven right into that are the Fihu rune to draw in the energy of wealth and the Wunjo rune to bring in joy. He didn't just slap this together on a whim. It was incredibly thought out and eventually evolved into its own ongoing narrative. It's literally a living map etched right onto his skin.
But here is a little secret for you. A hypersigil doesn't actually have to look all dark and occult. It can be hiding right in plain sight. Seriously, a business plan where every single objective acts as a charged sigil, that is a hypersigil. Even a carefully curated music playlist where the emotional arc mirrors your big life goal can work exactly the same way. It's all about the intention and that layered, ongoing narrative you're building.
All right, part 3, simple sigils versus hypersigils, looking at scope and scale. When you compare the two side by side, the jump in scale is just massive. A simple sigil's goal is single and specific. A hypersigil? Complex and multifaceted. The form goes from one abstract little glyph to a whole piece of art, a story, a business plan, or a tattoo. The duration stretches from short-term to long-term and ongoing. And honestly, the biggest shift is the charging process. You go from one peak moment of gnosis to a continuous, lived, everyday process.
So the absolute most crucial operational difference boils down to this. A simple sigil is basically a fire and forget operation. You cast it, you walk away, you forget about it. A hypersigil is the exact opposite. It's a continuous process of creation. It requires you to have an ongoing, evolving, back-and-forth dialogue with reality itself.
Now, I want to clarify a really common question that pops up in the source text. How is a hypersigil different from a servitor? Well, a servitor is like a semi-autonomous entity. You delegate a task to it, and it goes off and does your bidding. But a hypersigil is a narrative map, a blueprint that you actually inhabit and execute. You're the one directing the story, not handing off a chore for someone else to do. Which brings us to part 4, the living map
and how to navigate the territory.
Let's trace out the actual lifespan of a hypersigil. On day 1, you start with that initial charging ritual using Gnosis. That's your big launch. But then for the next few weeks, you have to sustain that momentum through mundane, real-world action. As months 2 through 6 roll around, you've got to keep a really close eye on the feedback loop of synchronicity, those weird coincidences and sudden opportunities that start popping up. And eventually, looking at a year or more out, you engage in what's called ritual editing or deprecation.
I actually want to pause here for a second because this point is absolutely vital. Mundane action is your most potent offering. Seriously, doing your actual daily work, running errands, doing chores, that is part of the spell. Every real-world step you take that aligns with your story is exactly how you charge a hypersigil. Turning your boring everyday life into the temple for this working is what gives it such immense power.
And of course, as you're out there taking those mundane actions, your goals are going to naturally evolve, right? That's where ritual editing comes into play. The text defines this as the formal ritual act of creating and attaching a new sigil to deprecate or retire a part of the goal that has become obsolete. You are actively updating your living map. If a piece of the map doesn't serve the big picture anymore, you ritually edit it out. You literally physically attach the new intention right over the old one.
All right, final section. Part 5, Risks and Realities, and the Danger of Drift.
When people ask how a hypersigil fails, the answer usually surprises them. Because the truth is, they rarely fail catastrophically. There's no big explosion. Instead, they just drift. If you aren't constantly paying attention, interacting with it, and taking that mundane action we talked about, the narrative simply loses steam. It fades right back into unrealized potential. It desperately needs you to keep the story moving forward.
Another huge danger here comes from the sheer complexity of long-term enchantment. The source uses this brilliant example. Say you create a hypersigil because you want to be a successful artist. Well, if you forget to weave in balancing components for your physical well-being in your relationships, you might actually succeed in manifesting that archetype entirely and become the starving, lonely artist. You absolutely have to map out a balanced, holistic reality, or it can backfire.
Because it is so complex, the text issues a very clear no-nonsense warning. This is definitely not for beginners. You really need to master simple sigils and servitors first. Honestly, you need a rock-solid grasp on the core principles of intent, charging, and non-attachment before you even think about constructing and maintaining something as massive as a hypersigil.
So we've explored how a hypersigil takes a single goal and turns it into a massive, sprawling, living map. It's a reality engine that you inhabit, that you revise, and that you execute through every single everyday action you take. It demands a total perspective shift, from just casting a quick spell to deliberately directing your entire life story. So knowing that the map is firmly in your hands, I'll leave you with this. Will your story drift, or will you direct it? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep exploring.